2nd August 2005, an Air France Airbus 340 was operating a scheduled transatlantic flight from Paris to Toronto. As they closed in towards Toronto, a storm was taking over the airport. With heavy rain and lightning, the aircraft approaches the runway. Touchdown, full brakes, full reversers applied. But the pilot is fighting to stop the big jet. Lives of 309 passengers hang in the balance. Will they be able to stop before the aircraft runs out of the runway? Let's find out what happened with Air France Flight 358.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
Wind shear.
Terrain ahead. Pull up.
On the afternoon of August 2nd, 2005, an Air France Airbus 340 was preparing for its flight from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport to Toronto Pearson Airport in Canada. The aircraft involved was built in 1999 with 4 CFM56 engines. The flight comprised of 297 passengers, 10 cabin crews, and 2 pilots, with a total of 309 souls on board. METAR, which stands for Meteorological Terminal Aviation Routine Weather, report was received in the pre-flight briefing package, showed very good visibility, sky clear, and no significant weather report at present time. But the weather forecast that the crew received showed thunderstorms during their arrival time. Because of that, the crew decided to uplift 3,000 kilograms of extra fuel, which was about 23 minutes of flying time. Whenever the weather at destination airport is bad, pilots do tend to uplift extra fuel to hold over the destination in hope for bad weather to clear. The captain of this flight was a very experienced pilot who had flown Airbus 300, 319, 320 and 321 series aircraft before, with a total of 15,411 hours with 1,788 hours on Airbus A340. He had a very good reputation of being easy to fly with and to have an open communication in maintaining a relaxed professional environment. The first officer was hired as a cabin crew, then he completed his pilot training and over the course of few years became a pilot with Air France. He had a total of 4,834 hours with previously flown Airbus 319, 320, 321 series. He had 2,500 hours on Airbus A340. He was a very competent pilot who had no problems during his training with Air France. The crew prepared the cockpit for departure and pushed back from the gate. They taxied towards runway 09 left and at time 11:53 Zulu, which is the UTC time, they lifted off from runway 09 left for a medium range flight over the Atlantic Ocean. They initially climbed to 35,000 feet and then further climbed to 36,000 feet for the Atlantic crossing. During the first half of the flight, the captain was the pilot flying. He wanted to have some takeoffs locked, thus he was the pilot flying. It was a very routine Atlantic crossing. The crew were doing routine tasks as like talking to the ATC, taking mandatory fuel checks and monitoring system performance and the airplane. At time 14:44 Zulu, the crew requested for weather of Toronto and Niagara Falls Airport. Niagara Falls was their destination alternate airport at that time. The METAR at these airports were good at that time, with no reported thunderstorm activity. When they requested for weather, they also did request for TAF, which means Terminal Area Forecast, which is a long version of weather forecast. It can be up to more than a day of forecast. But this crew did not receive any TAF because by mistake they selected TAF short instead of TAF long. Toronto had TAF long available, a longer version of weather forecast for the pilots. Sometime around 16:17 Zulu, the crew exchanged pilot flying duties. Now the first officer became pilot flying and captain became pilot not flying. Autopilot 2 was switched from Autopilot 1 as in line with whoever is the pilot flying. The flight continued normally without any significant events. But in Toronto, the things were changing rapidly now. The visibility was reducing, area around the airport was started to get covered with cumulonimbus or CB clouds, with heavy rain showers in increasing intensity. Rapidly changing weather is something that has always been and will be a threat to flight safety. At 17:50 Zulu, they sent Air France operations an ACARS message about their arrival time, which was a very routine practice. They received a reply with their parking gate number. but the message did not include that there was a red alert at the time at Toronto Airport. Whenever the lightning detectors record a predetermined number of lightning strikes near the airport authority at Toronto issued a red alert. Because of the red alert, airlines may choose to halt the ground operations if required. Air France operations were not responsible to alert the crew about this red alert. About an hour before the landing, the crew requested for METAR of Niagara Falls, Ottawa, and Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Niagara Falls Airport showed thunderstorm activity around the airport, but Ottawa and Cleveland Airport was clear of any thunderstorm activity. As Niagara Falls was their alternate airport in case of a diversion, the weather at Niagara Falls was not perfect, so the crew redesignated Ottawa as their new alternate airport if required in case of a diversion. Fuel remaining at this time was about 12,200 kilograms, and fuel required to divert to Ottawa was about 7,300 kilograms. They calculated that they had about 14 minutes of holding fuel available at Toronto Airport before they needed to divert to Ottawa Airport. As they got closer to the destination, they prepared the cockpit for arrival and did their approach briefing, except the runway, because they did not knew what runway they could expect to land on. Weather at Toronto Airport was getting bad, so many airplanes ahead of Air France 358 were in a holding pattern. Because of that, Air France 358 was told to reduce their speed. Crew began their descent into Toronto and requested for latest METAR. It indicated visibility of 4 statute mile in heavy rain showers, thunderstorm activity with temperature of 24 degrees Celsius. Crew were now fully aware of the bad weather developing in Toronto, so as a precaution, they briefed the windshield escape maneuver. This is how pilots always stay ahead of the aircraft, by preparing themselves to what might happen in the future. At 1922 Zulu, Air France 358 was turned onto a heading of 040 degrees, with ATC advising them that airplanes were now heading towards the airport in an attempt to land. ATC also told them to expect further clearance by 1950 Zulu. Further clearance means a time when they can expect to start the approach towards the airport. The time 1950 Zulu would be close to the time when they might have to divert to Ottawa, so the crew discussed Air France's policy of when to declare the minimum fuel. The policy states that if the estimated fuel at landing is forecast to be less than 1.5 times the final reserve, the crew must declare minimum fuel to the ATC. In this case, it was 4,200 kilograms. But this does not provide any priority handling to the aircraft, but advises ATC that an emergency situation may develop if the flight is subject to any further delays. The crew were doing everything any other crew would do in these situations. They were playing the game how it was meant to be played. They were cleared for the arrival, and at this time they had 9,300 kilograms fuel remaining, and they were about 137 nautical miles away from the airport. At this time, they were 2,000 kilograms above the minimum diversion fuel required of 7,300 kilograms to Ottawa Airport. They had about 6 to 10 minutes of holding fuel available. Any further delay would most possibly lead to a diversion to Ottawa Airport. Little while after that, ATC told them to expect runway 24 left for arrival. Toronto has 5 runways. At that time, runway 23, 24 right, 24 left were in use. Arriving aircrafts were not accepting to land on the longest runway, which was runway 23, because of the proximity of storms near it. And runway 24 right became inoperative around 1900 Zulu because its ILS antenna was damaged during the heavy thunderstorm activity. So the only option left was runway 24 left, which coincidentally was the shortest runway available in Toronto at that time. Landing in these weather conditions on such a runway will be a tricky thing with no margin of error. Once the crew got information on which runway they will land, they conducted the briefing for ILS 24 left. Everything was going as it should be except 2 things. They did not brief the missed approach procedure for runway 24 left. Most importantly, they did not calculate the landing distance required to stop on runway 24 left. On a sunny dry day, this probably wouldn't have mattered much. But today, when it was raining heavily, runways contaminated by water, not doing these calculations will play a vital role in what's going to happen next. As the weather became worse over Toronto Airport, many aircraft started to divert to their alternate airport. Air France 358 was number 3 behind 2 aircraft in the landing sequence. At 1953 Zulu, they completed their approach checklist and started to configure the aircraft for landing. The aircraft that landed ahead of them told ATC that the weather towards the north was very bad, as it was soon approaching over the Toronto airport. They also reported that the braking action was poor. Hearing this, the crew selected the auto brake setting from low to medium. But still, they were unaware of the landing distance required to stop under these conditions of poor braking. As the aircraft got established on localizer, the airplane was in heavy rain with a lot of turbulence. The autopilot got disengaged because of it, so they had to re-engage the autopilot again. They continued the approach and selected flaps 3, then flaps full, and reduced to the final approach speed of 140 knots as they got established on the ILS for runway 24 left. It was lightning all around the airfield, and the ATC tower instruments, which measured the winds, also got inoperative because of that. A regional jet that landed ahead of them told that the winds were 290 degrees, 15, gust 20, and the braking action was poor. It was all dark in thick rainy clouds as they got closer to the airport. This was an approach where the margin for error was 0. As they approached the runway, it was half visible with other half lost in low visibility due to the heavy rain. The crew could see lightning on both sides of the runway and at the end of the runway. They started the windshield wipers on slow, and around 300 feet, the first officer disengaged the autopilot and the auto thrust. The workload of both the crews were becoming very high in this very challenging situation. As they approached the minimums, they had two options, either to continue or discontinue the approach. Both pilots saw the end of the runway was also filled with severe bad weather, so doing a go-around straight into it might not be the best option. So the captain decided to continue the approach. As they approached the runway 24 left, there was a shift in wind. Now the winds were coming from the tail of the aircraft at about 10 knots. They deviated slightly above the glide slope and crossed the threshold at a height of about 90 feet, rather than the idle threshold crossing height of 50 feet. This slight increase of threshold crossing height increased the landing distance required to stop. The aircraft began to flare at 40 feet, with thrust coming to idle subsequently. The aircraft finally, with this reduced visibility due to the rain, touched down at 3,800 feet from the start of the runway. The crew now had only 5,000 feet of runway left to stop the mighty Airbus A340. They applied maximum manual wheel brakes but selected the reverse thrust after a delay of 13 seconds and tried to stop the aircraft. Due to poor braking action, the aircraft's deceleration was not very good. The crew were trying their best to stop the aircraft with the runway and approaching. To the horror of both pilots, there was no more runway left to stop. The A340 departed the runway at 80 knots, then crossing a highway and eventually coming to a stop. Soon the aircraft was on fire. The cabin crew, seeing the fire, immediately ordered evacuation. With only half number of available exits, all the passengers and the crew eventually evacuated safely with just few injuries to some passengers. After a miracle, all 309 souls on board were safe. Long landing. Being above glide slope over threshold and increasing thrust to compensate for reducing airspeed and keeping the thrust setting there for a longer period of time increased the energy of the aircraft, which increased the ground speed, resulting in the long landing touchdown at 3,800 feet from the start of the runway. If the auto throttle would have been engaged, it would have reduced the workload of the first officer. Obscured vision. Heavy rain reduced the visibility, which obscured the vision through the windshield during flare, not calculating the landing distance required. As you can see from this chart of Air France, with no wind conditions, medium brake setting on a wet runway, the distance required to stop is 5,828 feet. But with a tailwind of 10 knots, it calls for a 21% increase in the landing distance required. So with a 10 knots of tailwind, medium brake setting on a wet runway, the landing distance required is 7,053 feet, which is still less than the runway available to stop, which was 9,000 feet. But on that day, since it was raining very heavily and the runway was not just wet, it was contaminated by water. So, assuming 1/4 inch, which is approximately 6 to 7 millimeters of water on the runway, with a 10 knot tailwind, using 4 reversers, the runway distance required to stop was 10,249 feet, which was more than the runway distance available to stop. So, even if the crew would have landed at the correct touchdown point, most probably they wouldn't have been able to stop. Late reverser deployment. They landed slightly off the centerline. Because of the workload and urging to bring the aircraft to the centerline during reduced visibility, the first officer deployed the reverse thrust after approximately 13 seconds after touchdown. This further increased the distance required to stop. Poor braking action. As the runway was heavily contaminated by water, it led to poor braking action, which only added to the bad luck of the crew. Policy for go-around. Air France at that time had a policy that only captains could make a decision to either go around or continue the approach. Here, the captain of Flight 358 did not call for a go around. This policy was later changed and encouraged the first officers also to call for a go around if deemed necessary.